In a small, quiet town in the Midwest during the late 1980s, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with tall oak trees, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. But beneath the calm surface of this sleepy little community, there were cracks. Prejudices simmered under the thin layer of politeness, waiting for the right moment to boil over. One person who often felt that tension was a young girl about 12 years old. She loved spending her afternoons sitting under an old oak tree near the neighborhood park. That tree became her favorite spot because it gave her shade and peace, away from the noise of school and home. With her sketchbook in hand, she would draw pictures or write stories, losing herself in her own world. Her skin glowed like polished wood, smooth and rich in color, but instead of seeing beauty, some people saw only difference. And unfortunately, differences made certain folks uncomfortable. There were 3 older boys in the area who seemed to take pride in making others feel small. They weren't much older, just 14 and 15, but they carried themselves as if they owned the streets. These boys roamed around together looking for someone weaker to pick on. To them, bullying wasn't just a habit, it was almost like a game. And on that summer day, their eyes landed on the girl under the tree. The leader of the group was tall and lanky, always carrying himself with a cocky grin. He had a lighter in his pocket, stolen from his dad's toolbox earlier that week. Flicking it open and closed had become his nervous tic, something he did whenever he got bored. His 2 friends followed him everywhere, laughing at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. Together, they strutted toward the girl, their shadows stretching long across the grass. At first, the girl didn't notice them. She was too focused on her drawing, her pencil moving steadily across the page. When she finally looked up, her heart sank. She recognized these boys all too well. They'd teased her before, calling her names and mocking the way she talked or dressed. But today, something about their energy felt different, darker, heavier. Still, she tried to ignore them, hoping they'd grow tired and leave her alone. But they didn't. Instead, they surrounded her, cutting off any chance of escape. One of them snatched her notebook out of her hands, flipping through the pages, while sneering at her sketches. "What is this garbage?" he said, tossing it aside. Another chimed in, mocking her hair, her clothes, anything they could think of to make her squirm. Their words stung, but she refused to cry. Crying would only give them what they wanted, power over her. Then came the moment that changed everything. The boy with the lighter leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You know what happens to people who don't know their place?" He spat, his voice dripping with venom. Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist tightly, forcing her palm against the metal bench beside her. Earlier, they'd secretly heated the bench using matches and a piece of scrap metal, turning it into a makeshift branding iron. Now, it was scorching hot. The pain hit her instantly. A searing, unbearable heat shot through her hand, and she screamed, louder than she ever had in her life. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pulled away, cradling her injured hand close to her chest. Blisto comforting theirs formed quickly, raw and angry against her dark skin. The boys laughed, high-fiving each, other as if they'd accomplished something impressive. Then, without another word, they walked away, leaving her sobbing and alone. Unbeknownst to them, someone had been watching from afar, a shy classmate who had always admired the girl's quiet strength. This witness stood frozen in shock, clutching, her backpack strapped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Fear gripped her throat, preventing her from stepping forward to help. What could she have done anyway? She was smaller than the boys, no match for their cruelty. But as she watched the girl collapse onto the ground, clutching her burned hand, guilt began to creep in. How could she let this happen? Why hadn't she said something? That night, the witness lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Images of the girl's tear-streaked face kept replaying in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she owed it to her, to humanity, to speak up. After all, staying silent wouldn't undo what had happened. It wouldn't erase the burn marks on the girl's hand or the trauma etched into her memory. By morning, the decision was clear. She had to tell someone. Even if it meant risking her own safety, she couldn't stay quiet anymore. Little did anyone know, this single act of bravery would set off a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire town and change the lives of everyone involved forever. The next morning, the girl didn't show up at school. Her absence wasn't unusual. She often kept to herself. But this time, something felt off. Whispers began to spread among the students like wildfire. A few kids claimed they'd seen her, walking with her mom earlier, her hand wrapped tightly in bandages. Others said she looked pale and shaken like she hadn't slept all night. The rumors grew louder, more detailed, until finally someone mentioned what had happened in the park. That's when things started to unravel. The shy classmate who had witnessed everything couldn't shake the image of the girl's burned hand from her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it, the blistered skin, the tears streaming down her face. It haunted her during class, at lunch, even when she tried to sleep. She knew she couldn't stay quiet any longer, but speaking up was terrifying. What if the boys found out? What if they came after her next? Still, she couldn't ignore the guilt gnawing at her conscience. After school that day, she lingered behind, waiting for the hallways to clear out. When she finally worked up the courage, she knocked on the principal's office door. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The principal, a kind woman in her 50s with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, looked up from her desk, surprised to see her there. "What is it?" the principal asked gently, sensing the girl's distress. For a moment, words failed her. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure where to start. Finally, tears spilled down her cheeks as she blurted out the whole story. The heated bench, the cruel laughter, the burn marks on the girl's hand. She described everything she'd seen, her voice trembling, but determined. By the time she finished, both of them were silent. The principal leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, her tone firm yet compassionate. "This isn't something we can ignore." Within hours, the news reached the authorities. Police, officers arrived at the school, asking questions and taking notes. Word traveled fast, and soon enough, the 3 older boys were identified as suspects. Their parents were called in, and tensions ran high as accusations flew back and forth. Some adults defended the boys, claiming they were just being kids and didn't understand the gravity of their actions. Others demanded justice, pointing out that no child deserved to be treated like that, no matter the circumstances. The town split into factions almost overnight. On one side were those who rallied behind the injured girl, calling for accountability and reform. They argued that bullying wasn't harmless teasing. It could leave scars that lasted a lifetime. On the other side were people who dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, saying the punishment should fit the crime. Tempers flared at town meetings, and social media buzzed with heated debates. For such a small community, it felt like the entire world had been turned upside down. Meanwhile, the girl endured painful treatments for her burns. Doctors warned her that the damage might never fully heal, leaving permanent scars on her hand. Physical therapy sessions became a regular part of her routine, each one more grueling than the last. But the emotional toll was even heavier. She struggled to trust anyone outside her immediate family, flinching whenever strangers got too close. Nights were the hardest. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, reliving the moment over and over again in her dreams. Her family did everything they could to support her. Her mom stayed by her side during every doctor's appointment, holding her hand and whisper. More importantly, they encouraged her to keep speaking up. "Your voice matters," they told her. "Don't let fear silence you." Slowly, painfully, she began to believe them. Hers tightly when the pain became unbearable. Her dad spent countless evenings researching legal options, determined to make sure the boys faced consequences for what they'd done. When the case went to juvenile court, the courtroom was packed. Supporters of the girl filled one side, holding signs and wearing ribbons to show solidarity. On the other side sat the families of the accused, their faces etched with anger and disbelief. The judge listened carefully as evidence was presented, Testimonies from witnesses, medical reports detailing the extent of the injuries, and photos of the charred bench. The boys sat slumped in their chairs, avoiding eye contact with everyone, including the girl. In the end, the verdict was clear. Each boy was sentenced to 2 years in a detention center, followed by mandatory counseling and community service upon release. The judge emphasized that the punishment wasn't just about retribution, it was about teaching them accountability and helping them grow into better people. But as the gavel fell, the real consequences were only beginning to unfold. For the boys, freedom from the detention center wouldn't mean true freedom at all. Their names would forever be linked to shame, whispered in hushed tones wherever they went. Friends distanced themselves, jobs slipped through their fingers, and relationships crumbled under the weight of their past actions. They thought they understood the price of their cruelty, but they had no idea how deeply it would haunt them in the years to come. As for the girl, she refused to let the incident define her. With the unwavering support of her family and newfound allies, she channeled her pain into purpose. She started speaking out against bullying, sharing her story at schools and community events. Her message was simple yet powerful. Kindness costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. Though the scars on her hand remained, they became symbols of resilience rather than suffering, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can still shine through. Years passed and the small Midwest town tried to move on, but the scars of that summer day lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. For the 3 boys who had committed the cruel act, life became a series of closed doors, awkward silences, and sideways glances. The detention center had been tough, but stepping back into the real world was even harder. People remembered what they had done, and no matter how much they wanted to forget, society wouldn't let them. The leader of the group, the tall and lanky one who had flicked the lighter that day, struggled the most. He couldn't shake off the memory of the girl's screams. They echoed in his mind at night, jolting him awake in cold sweats. During the day, he avoided mirrors because he couldn't stand looking at himself. His once promising future as a star athlete was now a distant dream. Coaches didn't want him on their teams, and teammates whispered behind his back. He ended up working odd jobs, cleaning floors, washing dishes, anything to keep busy, but nothing could distract him from the guilt gnawing at his insides. To numb the pain, he turned to alcohol. Every evening, after another long, exhausting day of pretending to be okay, he'd sit alone in his tiny apartment, nursing a bottle until the edges of his thoughts blurred. Sometimes, he'd stare at his hands, remembering how they had held the lighter, how they had forced her palm onto that scorching bench. He hated those hands now, almost as much as he hated himself. Friends? He didn't have any left. The few people who still talked to him did so out of pity, not loyalty. The second boy, shorter and stockier, coped differently. He didn't drink or isolate himself like the first boy, but bitterness consumed him instead. He blamed everyone else for his misfortune, the system, the media, even the girl herself. "Why can't she just get over it?" he muttered under his breath whenever her name came up in conversation. Deep down, though, he knew the truth. He replayed the incident in his head over and over again, wondering why he hadn't stopped it when he had the chance. Why hadn't he walked away? Why had he laughed along with the others? His anger pushed people away. Old friends stopped inviting him to hang out, tired of his constant complaints and sharp tongue. Even his family grew distant, unsure how to help someone who refused to take responsibility for his actions. He found himself spending more time alone, scrolling through social media late at night, envying the lives of others. Everyone seemed happier, freer, unburdened by the weight he carried daily. It wasn't fair, or so he told himself. The third boy, quieter than the other 2, decided to run, literally. As soon as he was released from the detention center, he packed his bags and moved to a city far away, hoping distance would erase his past. At first it worked. In the bustling crowds and towering buildings, he felt anonymous, invisible. He got a job at a warehouse where no one asked questions about his background. For a while, he convinced himself that he could start fresh, that The person he used to be didn't exist anymore, but no matter how far he ran, reminders followed him. Once, during a company picnic, someone recognized his face from an old news article online. The whispers started again, and though no one confronted him directly, he could feel their judgment burning into his skin. Another time, he saw a poster for an anti-bullying campaign featuring the girl's story. Her face stared back at him from the glossy paper, calm and confident despite everything she'd endured. He tore the poster down before anyone noticed, but the image stayed burned into his brain. Each of these boys carried their guilt differently, but none of them escaped it entirely. They thought serving their time in the detention center would absolve them, but the real punishment was living with themselves afterward. Every glance, every comment, every sleepless night reminded them of what they had done and who they had hurt. Meanwhile, the girl continued to rebuild her life. She didn't pretend the incident hadn't happened. Instead, she embraced it as part of her journey. With support from her family and a growing network of advocates, she channeled her pain into purpose. She began speaking publicly about her experience, addressing schools, community centers, and even local government meetings. Her speeches were raw and honest, filled with moments of vulnerability that resonated deeply with her audiences. She never sugarcoated the truth. She talked about the physical pain of her burns, the emotional toll of being targeted, and the long road to healing. But she also spoke about hope, how she had chosen to rise above hatred and use her voice to inspire change. People listened, really listened, and many were moved to tears. Teachers invited her back year after year. Parents thanked her for opening their eyes, and students approached her after events to share their own struggles with bullying. Despite her strength, she wasn't immune to the lingering effects of that traumatic day. There were moments when fear crept back in, especially in crowded places or when strangers stood too close. Some nights she still woke up crying, her hand throbbing as if the burn were fresh again. Yet she refused to let those moments define her. Instead, she leaned on her loved ones, journaling her thoughts and practicing self-care to stay grounded. Her advocacy work gained momentum, earning her recognition beyond the town. Local newspapers wrote articles about her courage, and she was invited to speak at larger events across the state. Through it all, she remained humble, always reminding herself that her mission wasn't about fame or revenge. It was about creating a safer, kinder world for others. Though the boys' actions had changed her life forever, they hadn't broken her. If anything, they had made her stronger. She often reflected on the irony. The very act meant to silence her had given her a platform to amplify her voice. And while forgiveness wasn't something she offered lightly, she understood that holding on to anger would only weigh her down. So she focused on the future, determined to turn her pain into progress. As the years rolled on, the paths of the three boys and the girl remained separate, but their stories intertwined in ways none of them could have anticipated. The scars they all carried, physical, emotional, and psychological, served as constant reminders of that fateful day. For some, those scars were a burden. For others, they were a catalyst for growth. What none of them realized yet was that their reckoning was far from over. The choices they had made and the ones they had yet to make would continue to shape their destinies in profound and unexpected ways. By the time they reached their mid-20s, the three boys who had once been inseparable found themselves drifting further apart. Life had thrown them into different corners of the world, each trying to outrun the ghosts of their past. But fate has a way of bringing people back together, especially when guilt is the thread tying them to one another. It happened on a chilly Friday night at a dimly lit bar tucked away in the outskirts of town. The leader of the group, the tall, lanky, one who had carried the lighter that day, sat alone at the counter nursing his third beer. He wasn't much of a drinker anymore, not like he used to be in his early 20s when alcohol was the only thing keeping him from spiraling completely. These days, he drank just enough to dull the edges of his thoughts, but never enough to lose control. Still, tonight felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the anniversary of the incident, or maybe it was just another reminder of how stuck he felt in his own life. As he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, he noticed two familiar faces walk through the door. At first, he thought he was imagining things. It had been years since he'd seen them, the shorter, stockier boy and the quiet one who had moved away. But there they were, unmistakable even after all this time. They looked older, wearier. But their presence hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he considered slipping out the back before they spotted him, but it was too late. Their eyes locked, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. "Hey," the stocky one said awkwardly, sliding onto the stool next to him. The quiet one followed suit, sitting on the other side. Neither of them smiled. There was no warmth in their greetings, only the weight of shared history hanging over them like a storm cloud. For a while, none of them spoke. The bartender placed fresh drinks in front of them, and they sipped silently, avoiding eye contact. Finally, the leader broke the silence. "What are you guys doing here?" His voice was low, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The stocky one shrugged. "Just passing through, thought I'd grab a drink before heading home." He glanced at the quiet one, who nodded in agreement. "Didn't expect to see you." "Yeah, same," the leader muttered, staring down at his glass. Another long pause stretched between them, filled only by the faint hum of music playing in the background. Then, almost involuntarily, the quiet one blurted out, "Do you ever think about her?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. The leader froze, his fingers tightening around his glass. Of course he thought about her. How could he not? Her screams still haunted his dreams, her face etched permanently into his memory. But admitting it out loud felt like opening a wound that would never heal. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mostly at night." The stocky one let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Me too. Can't get her out of my head, no matter what I do. Feels like, I don't know, like karma's screwing with me or something." The quiet one nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I tried running from it," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "Moved to a new city, started over, but it doesn't work. You can't run from yourself." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. The leader took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "We should apologize," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. "To her, face to face." The other two stared at him, stunned. The stocky one shook his head vehemently. "Are you crazy? She'll never forgive us. Besides, what's the point? It won't change anything." "It might not change anything for her," the leader shot back, his tone firmer now. "But it might change something for us. Don't you feel like we owe her that much?" The quiet one leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "He's right," he said softly. "We can't undo what we did, but maybe apologizing will help us live with ourselves. Even if she hates us, at least we'll know we tried." The stocky one opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He knew they were right, even if he didn't want to admit it. For years, he'd convinced himself that moving on meant forgetting. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The guilt wouldn't disappear until they faced it head on. After a long moment, he sighed heavily. "Fine. Let's do it. But how do we even find her?" That was the tricky part. None of them had kept track of her over the years, and they weren't exactly welcome in her circle. Still, the quiet one suggested they start online. Social media had made it easier to find people, and given how active she had become in advocacy work, it wasn't hard to locate her profiles. As they scrolled through pictures and videos of her speaking at events, leading workshops and inspiring crowds, a strange mix of shame and admiration washed over them. "She's amazing," the leader murmured, his voice tinged with awe. "Look at everything she's done despite what we put her through." The stocky one nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, she's stronger than all of us combined." The quiet one added, "And smarter too. Look at how many people listen to her now. She's making a real difference." For the first time in years, they felt something other than guilt. A flicker of pride, however small, for the person she had become. But that pride was quickly overshadowed by the realization of how far they had fallen in comparison. While she had risen above hatred and turned her pain into purpose, they had spent their lives running, hiding, and blaming everyone else for their misery. Arranging a meeting took months of planning and courage building. Each of them wrestled with doubts and fears, wondering if they were doing the right thing, or if they were simply setting themselves up for rejection. They rehearsed what they would say, practicing apologies that felt inadequate no matter Many times they rewrote them. When the day finally came, their nerves were frayed, their palms sweaty, and their hearts pounding. They arrived at her house on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where golden leaves danced in the breeze and the sun cast long shadows across the ground. Standing outside her front door, they hesitated, unsure if they should knock. What if she slammed the door in their faces? What if she called the police? They had no idea how she would react, and the uncertainty terrified them. Finally, the leader raised his fist and knocked gently. Moments later, the door opened, and there she stood. She looked different from the last time they had seen her, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. Gone was the timid girl under the tree. In her place was a confident woman, radiating strength and grace. Her hand, scarred but steady, rested lightly on the door frame as she regarded them with an unreadable expression. "I don't know why you're here," she said evenly, her voice calm yet firm, "but you should know. I'm not the same scared little girl you heard all those years ago." Her words struck them like a hammer, forcing them to confront the reality of who they were and what they had done. For the first time, they truly understood the depth of their actions and the lifelong impact they had left on someone else's soul. The three men stood frozen on her doorstep, their faces pale and their hearts racing. They had rehearsed what they would say 100 times in their heads, but now that the moment was here, all their carefully planned words seemed hollow. The woman before them wasn't the fragile girl they remembered. She was strong, composed, and unshaken by their presence. Her eyes, sharp and steady, bore into theirs, demanding honesty. "I don't know why you're here," she repeated, her tone firm but not angry. "But you should know I'm not the same scared little girl you heard all those years ago." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring them to explain themselves. For a moment, none of them could speak. The leader, the one who had flicked the lighter that day, cleared his throat nervously. We came to apologize," he stammered, his voice trembling. "To tell you how sorry we are for what we did." She didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stared at them, waiting. Encouraged by her silence, the stocky one stepped forward hesitantly. "What we did to you, it was wrong. So wrong. I've thought about it every single day since, and I hate myself for it." His voice cracked as tears welled up in his eyes. "I'll never forgive myself for hurting you like that." The quiet one nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "We were kids, but that's no excuse," he said softly. "We were cruel, selfish, and stupid, and we can't take back what we did. But maybe we can try to make things right." For a long time she didn't respond. She studied each of them carefully, as if searching for some sign of sincerity in their expressions. Then, without saying a word, she stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. They hesitated, unsure if this was a good idea, but eventually they followed her inside. Her living room was warm and inviting, filled with books, plants, and photos of smiling faces. It was clear this was a space where love and kindness thrived, a stark contrast to the coldness they had brought into her life all those years ago. She motioned for them to sit on the couch while she took a chair across from them, her posture relaxed but alert. "Start talking," she said simply, folding her hands in her lap. Her voice was calm, but there was an intensity behind it that made them squirm. The leader spoke first, his words spilling out in a rush. He told her about the nightmares that plagued him, the guilt that consumed him every waking moment. He described how he had turned to alcohol to numb the pain, only to realize it wasn't enough. "I see your face every time I close my eyes," he confessed, his voice breaking. "And I hate myself for what I put you through. I wish I could go back and stop myself, but I can't." All I can do is say I'm sorry. The stocky one chimed in next, his voice thick with emotion. I spent years blaming everyone else for my problems, he admitted. But deep down, I knew it was me. I was weak, too scared to stand up to them, too cowardly to walk away. I let you down when you needed someone to help you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Finally, the quiet one spoke. I ran, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I moved far enough away I could leave my guilt behind, but it followed me everywhere. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape the memory of what we did to you. You didn't deserve any of it. As they spoke, tears streamed down their faces, raw and unfiltered. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They knew they didn't deserve it, but they hoped their apology might bring them some measure of peace. When they finished, the room fell silent, heavy with the weight of their confessions. She sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything they had said. Then, she leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. Do you think apologizing makes you better people? She asked, her voice soft but piercing. Because it doesn't. Words don't erase scars. They don't undo pain. The men flinched, their heads dropping in shame. She was right, and they knew it. Apologies couldn't heal the burns on her hand or the trauma buried deep within her soul, but still, they waited, hoping against hope that she might see even the smallest glimmer of redemption in their actions. After a long pause, she sighed deeply. Your apologies don't fix what happened, she said finally. But maybe, they can help you start healing. That's more than I thought you deserved. Her words hit them like a punch to the gut, both brutal and unexpectedly compassionate. She wasn't letting them off the hook, far from it, but she was giving them a chance to confront their guilt and grow from it. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, a lifeline, however fragile, to cling to. Over the next hour, they talked openly about the incident, their regrets, and the ways it had shaped their lives. She listened patiently, occasionally interjecting, with questions or observations that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. By the end of the conversation, they felt emotionally drained but strangely lighter, as if a tiny piece of the burden they'd carried for so long had been lifted. Before they left, she gave them one final piece of advice. If you really want to make amends, don't just apologize to me, she said firmly. Use your voices to help others. Speak out against bullying, racism, and cruelty wherever you see it. Be the kind of men who protect instead of harm. They promised they would, though they knew it wouldn't be easy. Walking out of her house that day, they felt a mix of relief and determination. For the first time in years, they saw a path forward, not to redemption perhaps, but to accountability. They understood now that true change wouldn't come overnight, but it was possible if they were willing to put in the work. Part 6. Redemption and reflection. In the months that followed, the three men began volunteering with organizations focused on anti-bullying initiatives and restorative justice programs. At first it was awkward. They struggled to find their footing, unsure how to contribute meaningfully. But as they shared their stories with others, they realized they weren't alone. Many people, young and old, carried similar scars, whether inflicted by bullies, systemic racism, or personal failures. Their experiences, painful as they were, became tools for connection and growth. Meanwhile, the woman continued her advocacy work, inspiring countless others with her resilience. Though she hadn't forgiven the men, she respected their efforts to change. Occasionally, she crossed paths with them at events or workshops, exchanging brief nods or smiles. Each encounter reminded her of how far she and they had come. Years later, reflecting on that fateful summer day, she smiled softly. They thought they could destroy me, she said during one of her speeches, but instead they gave me a reason to rise. And so, the legacy of that tragic day transformed, not just for her, but for the three boys whose lives it haunted. Their choices shaped destinies none of them could have foreseen, proving that even in darkness there is always a chance for light, if one has the courage to seek it. In the years that followed, The three men threw themselves into their volunteer work with a determination that surprised even themselves. At first, it was awkward and uncomfortable. They weren't used to being in environments where people looked at them with suspicion or outright hostility. But they stuck with it, showing up week after week, determined to prove, not just to others but to themselves, that they were capable of change. The leader of the group started working with a local organization that focused on mentoring troubled teens. Many of these kids reminded him of his younger self, angry, lost, and desperate to fit in. He shared his story with them, not as a cautionary tale, but as a way to show them that actions have consequences, and that it's never too late to turn things around. Some of the kids rolled their eyes at first, dismissing him as another adult trying to lecture them. But over time, they began to open up, sharing their own struggles and fears. Seeing them grow gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The stocky one found himself drawn to community outreach programs aimed at educating parents and teachers about bullying. He attended workshops, helped organize events, and even spoke publicly about his past mistakes. It wasn't easy standing in front of crowds, knowing that some people judged him harshly before he even opened his mouth. But he pushed through the discomfort because he believed in the message. "I know what it feels like to be on both sides," he'd say during his talks. "I've been the bully, and I've been eaten alive by guilt. Trust me, it's better to choose kindness." The quiet one, who had once tried to run from his past, discovered a passion for art therapy. He worked with survivors of trauma, encouraging them to express their emotions through painting, drawing, and writing. Though he rarely spoke about his own experiences, his presence alone seemed to offer comfort to those who needed it most. There was something healing about seeing someone who had caused harm transform into someone who actively sought to repair it. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly, tentatively, people began to see them differently. Not as monsters, but as flawed human beings trying to make amends. It wasn't universal acceptance, they still faced judgment and mistrust, but it was enough to keep them going. Each small victory fueled their resolve to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, the woman whose life they had forever altered continued to thrive in her advocacy work. She traveled across the country, speaking at schools, conferences, and community events. Her speeches were powerful, raw, and deeply personal. She talked about the pain of being bullied, the long road to healing, and the importance of resilience. But she also emphasized forgiveness, not necessarily forgiving others, but learning to forgive yourself so you can move forward. Her journey hadn't been easy. Even after all these years, there were moments when fear crept back in, especially in crowded places or when strangers stood too close. Sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night, her hand throbbing as if the burn were fresh again. Yet she refused to let those moments define her. Instead, she leaned on her support system, her family, friends, and fellow advocates to stay grounded. What amazed her most was how much she had grown since that fateful day in the park. Back then, she had been a quiet, shy girl who preferred to blend into the background. Now she was a confident, outspoken leader who inspired thousands with her courage and compassion. The scars on her hand remained, but they no longer represented pain and suffering. To her, they symbolized strength, survival, and the ability to rise above hatred. Every now and then she crossed paths with the three men at workshops, fundraisers, or community meetings. Their interactions were brief but meaningful. A nod here, a smile there. Occasionally they exchanged a few words, updating each other on their progress. While she hadn't forgiven them entirely, she respected the effort they were putting into changing their lives. And though she would never admit it aloud, part of her felt a strange sense of gratitude toward them. Without realizing it, they had given her a mission, a reason to fight for justice and equality. One evening, several years after their initial meeting, the three men received an invitation to attend a special event hosted by the very woman they had wronged. It was a celebration, of sorts, marking a decade of her advocacy work. Hesitant but curious, they decided to go. The event took place in a large auditorium filled with people from all walks of life. As they walked in, they felt a mix of nerves and pride. Nerves because they knew many attendees might recognize them. and pride because they were witnessing firsthand the impact of her work. Posters lined the walls, showcasing photos and stories of individuals whose lives she had touched. One poster featured a quote from her: "Kindness is a choice, and it's one we should all make every single day." When it was time for her to speak, the room fell silent. She stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding yet warm. She thanked everyone for coming, acknowledging the countless supporters who had helped her along the way. Then, unexpectedly, she turned her attention to the three men sitting quietly in the audience. "I want to take a moment to talk about accountability," she began, her voice steady and clear. "These three men," she gestured toward them, "did something unforgivable to me many years ago. They hurt me in ways that will stay with me for the rest of my life. But instead of letting bitterness consume me, I chose to focus on using my experience to help others." She paused, looking directly at them. "They came to me once, apologizing for what they did. At the time, I told them their apologies wouldn't erase the scars or undo the pain. But I also told them that maybe, just maybe, their apologies could help them heal. Today I see that they've taken steps to do exactly that. They've dedicated themselves to helping others, to speaking out against cruelty, and to becoming better versions of themselves." Her words brought tears to their eyes along with murmurs of approval from the crowd. When she finished speaking, the entire room erupted into applause. For the first time in years, the three men felt a flicker of hope. Not for redemption, perhaps, but for a chance to rebuild their lives in a way that honored the lessons they had learned. As the event drew to a close, the woman approached them. Smiling gently, she extended her hand. After a moment's hesitation, the leader shook it, followed by the other two. No words were exchanged, but the gesture spoke volumes. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't meant to be, but it was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of the past, of the pain, and of the possibility of growth. That night, as they drove home together, the three men sat in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. They knew their journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, they felt hopeful. Hopeful that they could continue to make amends, to spread kindness, and to live lives that mattered. And, as for the woman, she returned home feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned her pain into purpose, her scars into symbols of resilience. Though the memory of that summer day would always linger, it no longer controlled her. Instead, it served as a reminder of her strength and of the power of choosing light over darkness. In the end, their stories intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted. What began as an act of cruelty transformed into a testament to the human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and change. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, there is always a chance for light, if one has the courage to seek it.